Jim Ju Quan didn't just slap a waitress, he broke the one rule that kept his empire invisible. He didn't realize that Marion wasn't serving coffee for the money, she was counting the exits. When the sting of his palm hit her cheek, it didn't spark a tear, it triggered a silent, digital kill switch that began deleting his bank accounts before he even reached his car. The Black Home was not just a restaurant, it was a kingdom. Inside its walls, the air smelled of expensive cigars and aged wine. At the center table sat Jin Ju Quan. He was a man who didn't just walk into a room, he owned the ground beneath it. His suit was worth more than most people made in a year, and his eyes were as cold as the ice in his glass. To his left and right sat men with thick necks and hidden guns, but Jin Ju Quan was the most dangerous person there. Marion moved quietly between the tables. She was tired. Her shift had started 8 hours ago, and her feet ached inside her cheap work shoes. She kept her head down, trying to be invisible. In this world, being noticed by men like Jin Ju Quan usually meant trouble. She just wanted to finish her shift, take her tips, and go home to her quiet apartment. More wine, Jin Ju Quan barked. He didn't look at her. He didn't even look at the glass. He just held it out, expecting the world to fill it. Marion hurried over. Her hands were steady, but the bottle was condensation slick. As she leaned in to pour the dark red liquid, one of Jin's men laughed loudly at a joke, bumping the table. A single, tiny drop of wine splashed onto the sleeve of Jin Ju Quan's white silk shirt. The table went silent. The air felt like it had been sucked out of the room. Marianne's heart hammered against her ribs. "I am so sorry, sir. Let me get a cloth." Jin Ju Quan stood up slowly. He looked at the tiny red stain on his cuff as if it were a mortal wound. Then, he looked at Marianne. His face didn't show anger, it showed a terrifying kind of boredom. Without a word, he swung his hand. The sound of the slap echoed like a gunshot. Marianne's head snapped to the side. The sting was immediate, a burning heat that turned her skin bright red. She stumbled back, the wine bottle shattering on the floor. Tears pricked her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She stood there, frozen, as the powerful man wiped his hand on a napkin. "You are nothing," Jin Ju Quan whispered, his voice like sliding gravel. "You are a bug on my shoe." He turned back to his meal, laughing with his men as if nothing had happened. He didn't notice the way Marianne's expression changed. The fear in her eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp light. She didn't beg for her job. She didn't scream. She simply turned around and walked out of the restaurant. As she stepped into the cool night air, she pulled a small, high-tech device from her pocket. Her thumb hovered over a red icon on the screen. Jin Ju Quan thought he had slapped a waitress. He didn't know he had just declared war on the one person who knew every secret his syndicate owned. With one tap, the first pillar of his empire began to crack. The walk home was long, but Marion didn't feel the cold or the ache in her legs anymore. The side of her face was swollen and throbbing, a constant reminder of the weight of Jin Ju Quan's hand. He thought he had ended the conversation with that slap. In reality, he had started a countdown that he couldn't stop. Marion reached her small apartment on the edge of the city. It looked like any other poor worker's home, but inside, things were different. She didn't turn on the lights. Instead, she sat down at a desk in the corner and opened a laptop that was far too expensive for a waitress to own. The blue light of the screen reflected in her dark, steady eyes. "Accessing the vault," she whispered. Her voice wasn't shaky anymore. It was deep and commanding. For 3 years, Marion had worked at the Black Home. She had played the part of the invisible servant perfectly. She had listened to the whispers of drunken lieutenants. She had memorized the faces of the corrupt politicians who came to shake Jin Ju Quan's hand. She had even cleaned the mud off his shoes. Every day, she gathered a little more data, waiting for the right moment to strike. She began to type. Her fingers flew across the keys. Lines of green code scrolled down the screen like rain. Jin Ju Quan believed his money was safe in offshore accounts, hidden behind layers of digital walls. He believed his shipping manifests were ghost files that no one could see. He was wrong. "You called me a bug," Marion said to the empty room. "But a bug can get inside the machine. And once I'm inside, I can break everything." She hit the enter key. Thousands of miles away, in a secure bank in Switzerland, a series of red flags began to pop up on a computer monitor. Millions of dollars, money meant to pay for Jin's private army and his upcoming drug shipments, began to move. It wasn't going to arrival. It was disappearing into thousands of untraceable charity accounts for orphans in hospitals. But she wasn't done. She opened a second file. This one contained photos, clear, sharp images of Jin Ju Quan meeting with the chief of police. She attached the file to an anonymous email address to the Internal Affairs Bureau and the city's biggest news station. As the sent notification blinked on her screen, Marion finally leaned back. She touched her bruised cheek and felt a small, cold smile form on her lips. By tomorrow morning, Jin Ju Quan would wake up as a king. By tomorrow night, he wouldn't even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee. The war had begun, and the Waitress had already won the first round. Jin Ju Quan woke up the next morning feeling like the ruler of the world. He dressed in a tailored navy blue suit and checked his reflection. He didn't think once about the waitress he had slapped the night before. To him, she was already forgotten, like a piece of trash thrown out of a car window. He walked downstairs to his massive dining room, expecting his usual breakfast and the daily reports of his growing wealth. However, the house felt different. Usually, his servants moved like clockwork, but today the hallways were silent. His lead bodyguard, a man who had been with him for 10 years, walked in with a face as pale as a ghost. He was holding a tablet with shaking hands. "Boss," the man whispered. "You need to see this." Jin Ju Quan grabbed the tablet. His eyes widened as he scrolled through the news headlines. Every major website was showing his face. There were photos of him shaking hands with the city's most corrupt officials. There were leaked documents showing exactly where his illegal warehouses were located. The headlines called him the Ghost King of Crime and claimed that an anonymous whistleblower had turned over years of evidence. "This is a lie!" Jin screamed, throwing the tablet against the wall. It shattered into pieces, but the truth remained. "Find out who did this. I want their head on a plate." He reached for his phone to call his lawyers, but the screen was dark. He tried his office landline, but there was no dial tone. He realized with a surge of panic that his entire communication network was being cut off. He ran to his computer to check his primary bank account, the one he used to pay his soldiers and buy his safety. When the screen loaded, his heart nearly stopped. The balance didn't say millions. It didn't even say thousands. It said $0. At the bottom of the screen, a small message box popped up. It was a simple text bubble that didn't belong to any banking software. It read, "A bug in the machine can be very expensive, Mr. Quan." Outside, the faint sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. They were coming from every direction. Jin Ju Quan looked at his trembling hands. For the first time in his life, he felt a cold, sharp blade of fear in his chest. He had spent years building a fortress of money and blood, and in a single night, a woman he had called nothing had pulled the bottom brick out. His syndicate wasn't just leaking, it was drowning. And the water was rising fast. The sirens were no longer faint, they were a screaming chorus surrounding the mansion. Jin Ju Quan stood in the center of his marble foyer, looking like a trapped animal. He turned to his men, expecting them to form a wall of protection around him as they always had. But the loyalty he had bought with money was vanishing as quickly as his bank balance. "Get the cars ready!" Jin shouted, his voice cracking. "We go to the northern docks. We can leave by boat." His men looked at each other, then back at their boss. They weren't moving. They had all seen the news. They knew that once the money was gone and the police had the files, Jin Ju Quan was no longer a king, he was a liability. One by one, they began to back away toward the side exits. They weren't going to die for a man who couldn't even pay for his own breakfast. "I said move!" Jin screamed, reaching for the gold-plated pistol tucked into his waistband. Before he could draw it, the heavy front doors of the mansion were kicked open. It wasn't the police who entered first. It was a group of silent, professional-looking people in dark tactical gear. They didn't wear police badges. They moved with a military precision that made Jin's heartbeat skip. Behind them walked a woman. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform anymore. Marion was dressed in a sharp, charcoal gray suit. Her hair, which had been tied back in a messy bun at the restaurant, was now sleek and professional. The bruise on her cheek was still there, a dark purple mark against her pale skin, but she didn't try to hide it. She wore it like a badge of honor. "You," Jean Juquan gasped, his eyes bulging. Who are you?" Marion walked across the marble floor, her heels clicking slowly and rhythmically. She stopped just a few feet away from him. The tactical team kept their weapons trained on Jin's remaining guards, who immediately dropped their guns and raised their hands. "My name is Agent Marion Vance," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I've spent 3 years waiting for you to get sloppy, Jean. I've watched you hurt people because you thought you were untouchable. I've watched you build a mountain of crime while I served your coffee." She stepped closer, looking directly into his terrified eyes. "Last night, you told me I was a bug on your shoe," she whispered. "But you forgot one thing. If you step on the wrong bug, it's not the bug that dies, it's the person who gets bitten. Your syndicate is gone. Your men have abandoned you. And your accounts are empty." Outside, the real police finally swarmed the grounds. Blue and red lights flashed against the expensive paintings on the walls. "You're a waitress," Jean whimpered, his arrogance completely shattered. "You're just a girl." "I was the girl who saw everything," Marion replied. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs, and tossed them at his feet. "Pick them up, Mr. Kwan. It's time to go to work." Jean Juquan stared at the handcuffs on the floor as if they were venomous snakes. The room was spinning. Just yesterday, he had been the most feared man in the city. Now, he was standing in his own home, surrounded by people he didn't recognize, being stared down by a woman he had treated like dirt. "You can't do this," Jean whispered, though his voice lacked any real power. "I have connections. I have people in the government. One phone call and you'll be the one in a cell." Marion didn't blink. She didn't even look angry, she looked bored. "The people you're talking about? They were the first ones we picked up this morning. Your connections are currently sitting in interrogation rooms trying to trade your name for a shorter sentence. You're the last piece of the puzzle, Jean. There is no one left to call." She signaled to her team. 2 of the tactical officers stepped forward, grabbed Jean Juquan by his arms, and forced him to his knees. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The sound was final. The Iron King was officially a prisoner. As they began to lead him away, Marion walked through the mansion one last time. She looked at the expensive statues and the gold-leafed frames. It was all bought with the pain of others. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital drive. She had one last task. She walked to the security room in the back of the house. The guards there had already fled. Marion plugged the drive into the main console. This was the kill switch she had mentioned. With a few keystrokes, she wiped every server in the building. Every piece of encrypted data, every hidden video, and every ledger was now safely stored on a government cloud, leaving Jin's local drives completely blank. She walked back out to the front lawn. The sun was fully up now, shining over the city. A black SUV pulled up, and a man stepped out. It was Daesh, the high-ranking guard who had always been the most observant. He wasn't in handcuffs. He walked over to Marianne and handed her a thick file. "It's all there," Daesh said quietly. "Every warehouse address and the names of the overseas suppliers." "Thank you, Daesh," Marianne said. "Your cooperation saved a lot of lives today." Jean Juquan, who was being pushed into the back of a police cruiser, saw the exchange. His face twisted in a mask of pure rage. You betrayed me too?" Daesh looked at his former boss with a look of pity. "You didn't pay us for loyalty, Jean. You paid us to be silent. But when you slapped that woman, you showed us that you didn't even respect the people who kept you safe. Why should we keep your secrets when you treat us like animals?" The car door slammed shut, cutting off Jin's scream. Marion watched the convoy drive away. Her face still hurt, and she was exhausted, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she could breathe. The syndicate hadn't just collapsed, it had been erased. With the mansion empty and Jean Juquan behind bars, the silence of the city felt different to Marianne. She didn't head back to the agency headquarters right away. Instead, she drove to a quiet, middle-class neighborhood far from the neon lights of the black home. She parked her car in front of a modest house with a well-kept garden. She sat in the car for a moment, looking at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The bruise on her cheek was turning a deep shade of yellow and green. It looked painful, but it no longer felt like a mark of shame. It was the catalyst that had ended a decade of crime. She took a deep breath, adjusted her suit jacket, and stepped out. Inside the house, a young girl named Jean Mu was sitting at a small wooden table. She was focused, her tongue poking out slightly as she drew in a leather notebook with a pencil. When the door opened, the girl looked up, her big dark eyes lighting up with recognition. "Marianne!" Jean Mu cried out, running to her. Marianne caught the girl in a hug, wincing slightly as the child's head brushed against her sore cheek. Jean Mu pulled back, her intelligent eyes immediately spotting the mark. She reached out a small hand, her expression turning serious. "Did the bad man do this?" Jean Mu asked quietly. Marianne knelt down so she was at eye level with the child. "He did. But he won't ever do it again. To me, or to anyone else." Jean Mu was the daughter of one of Jean Ju Quan's former accountants, a man who had tried to leave the syndicate and paid the ultimate price. Marianne had made it her personal mission to protect the girl, using her role as an undercover waitress to keep a close watch on the family's safety while gathering evidence. "Is it over?" the girl asked, clutching her notebook to her chest. "It's over," Marianne promised. "The accounts are closed, the offices are empty, and the man who thought he owned the city is sitting in a room with no windows." Jean Mu nodded slowly, then opened her notebook. She turned to a fresh page and began to draw a picture of a sun rising over a tall building. "My dad said the truth is like the sun. You can try to hide it, but it always comes up in the morning." Marianne smiled, a genuine one this time. She realized that while the digital codes and the tactical raids had destroyed the syndicate's power, it was the resilience of people like Jean Mu that truly replaced the darkness. She stayed with the girl for an hour, helping her with her drawings and enjoying the simple peace of a home that was no longer under a shadow. As she eventually walked back to her car, Marianne looked up at the sky. Her job was far from finished. There were always more kings who thought they were gods, but for today, the world was a little bit lighter. The waitress was gone, the agent had succeeded, and the syndicate was nothing but a memory in the wind. The news of Jean Ju Quan's arrest hit the city like a tidal wave. By the afternoon of the next day, every television screen and every shop window showed the same footage, the mighty Mafia boss being led away in handcuffs, his head bowed to hide his face from the cameras. For the public, it was a shock. For the criminal underworld, it was a signal that the old ways of doing business were dead. Marianne spent the morning at the central police station. She wasn't in the background anymore. She sat in a glass-walled office, surrounded by stacks of files and ringing telephones. Detectives who used to ignore her when she served them coffee at the Black Home now stood straight and called her ma'am. "We've secured the shipping containers at the North Docks," an officer said, stepping into our office. "It's just like your report said. We found the hidden compartments. There's enough evidence there to keep Jean Ju Quan in prison for 3 lifetimes. "Good," Marianne replied, not looking up from her computer. "What about his legal team?" The officer chuckled. "That's the best part. His top lawyer was caught trying to shred documents at 3 a.m. He's in the cell right next to Jean. They don't have anyone left to fight for them." Marianne finally looked up. Despite the victory, she felt a heavy weight. She knew that when an empire falls, it leaves a hole. If they weren't careful, someone even worse than Jean Ju Quan would try to fill it. She had to make sure the collapsing syndicate didn't just break apart, it had to be dissolved completely so nothing could grow back. She decided to visit the interrogation wing. She walked down the cold, sterile hallway until she reached room 902. Through the one-way glass, she saw Jean Ju Quan. He looked small. Without his expensive suit and his army of guards, he was just a middle-aged man in a gray jumpsuit. He was staring at his hands, which were resting on the metal table. She stepped into the room. The door clicked shut behind her. Jean Ju Quan didn't look up at first. "I want my phone call," he muttered. "You've had 3, Jean." No one picked up, Marianne said, sitting across from him. He finally raised his head. His eyes were red, and the arrogance was replaced by a desperate kind of confusion. "Why you? Out of all the people I've stepped on, why was it a waitress?" "Because you didn't see me," Marianne said simply. You spent so much time looking at the ceiling that you never noticed who was standing right in front of you. You thought your power came from fear, but fear only works until people have nothing left to lose. She pushed a single piece of paper across the table. It was a list of names, men who worked for him, men he thought were his brothers. Every single one of them had signed a confession against him in exchange for protection. Your syndicate didn't collapse because of me, she whispered. It collapsed because you built it on a foundation of hate. I just gave it a little push. Jin Juquan looked at the list, and for the first time, he went completely silent. He finally realized that his kingdom wasn't stolen, it was never really his to begin with.